She thought the cold would kill her first. An elderly woman, soaked by snow, holding a feverish child whose breathing was fading with every step. Her home was gone. Her help was gone. And the world had already decided she didn't matter. Then, under a flickering streetlight, she made one desperate choice. She knocked on the window of a stranger's luxury car. What happened next wasn't kindness as usual. It exposed power, prejudice, and a truth many people refuse to see. Before we go back, let us know where you're watching from. And if you're new here, subscribe to Horovia and connect with us for daily new stories, because tomorrow we've got something extra special for you. Before that night, Margaret Sullivan's life was quiet, predictable, and painfully fragile. At 72, she measured her days in small routines, warming leftover soup on a single burner, folding laundry slowly to ease the ache in her joints, and making sure her granddaughter Kayla stayed close enough that she could hear her breathing at night. They didn't have much, but they had rules that kept them going. Stay warm, stay together, and don't draw attention in a town that had long stopped caring about people like them. Edgewater was once a working town. Now it was a place people passed through without stopping, a place where abandoned houses outnumbered open shops and help never came without a price. Margaret knew that better than anyone. She lived on a fixed income that barely stretched far enough to cover food, heat, and the free clinic when Kayla got sick. There was no room for emergencies, no cushion for bad luck. Still, Margaret believed that if she kept her head down and paid what she could, trouble might leave her alone. Kayla was her reason for everything. 4 years old, small for her age, with a cough that lingered longer than it should have. Margaret told herself it was just a cold, something rest and care would fix. She had no idea how quickly manageable could turn into dangerous. And beneath all of it, unspoken but always present, was fear. Fear of debt collectors who preyed on the poor. Fear of systems that punished weakness. Fear that one mistake, one missed payment, one bad night could undo everything. Margaret went to bed that evening believing tomorrow would be hard, but survivable. She didn't know that by morning, her home, her safety, and her faith in fairness would be ripped away. And she had no idea that the world was about to test whether anyone would see her suffering or simply look away. The pounding on the door didn't sound like a mistake. It wasn't confused or hesitant. It was violent, deliberate, and impatient, like whoever stood outside already believed they owned what was inside. Margaret felt it in her chest before she even moved. In Edgewater, you learned the difference between a knock and a threat. She moved quickly despite her aching knees, whispering Kayla's name as she crossed the cold floor. The heat had gone out hours earlier, and the house felt hollow, brittle, like it might crack under pressure. Kayla was already coughing again, her small body burning beneath thin blankets. Margaret told herself she would handle it in the morning, the same way she always did, stretching medicine, stretching hope. But the pounding came again, harder this time, rattling the doorframe. When she opened the door, the night rushed in with snow, wind, and 3 men who did not bother hiding their intentions. They stepped inside without permission, tracking slush across her floor, filling the room with their size and their certainty. Margaret understood immediately. This was not about paperwork or law. This was about power, about reminding people like her that they did not get grace. They spoke of debt numbers that made no sense, obligations tied to a son who had already paid with his life. Margaret tried to explain. She tried to reason. She tried to protect. None of it mattered. The men never raised their voices. They didn't have to. They spoke calmly, the way people do when they know resistance is pointless. When Kayla appeared in the doorway, fever-glossed eyes blinking against the light, everything changed. Margaret felt fear twist into something sharper, panic edged with rage. She begged for time. She begged for mercy. The answer was cold and final. The house was no longer hers. The night would take care of the rest. Minutes later, they were outside. Snow whipped across their faces as the door closed behind them with a sound that felt permanent. Margaret wrapped Kayla in her own coat, feeling the child shiver violently, her breathing growing thin and uneven. The street was empty. The town was silent. Help was nowhere. They walked because stopping felt worse. Each step stole strength from Margaret's legs. Each cough from Kayla sounded weaker than the last. Under a flickering streetlight, Margaret knelt in the snow, touching Kayla's burning forehead and realizing the truth she'd been trying to avoid. The illness had crossed into danger. That was when she saw the car. It didn't belong there, clean, expensive, still. A man sat inside, warm, untouched by the storm. Margaret hesitated, every lesson she'd learned screaming at her to stay away. People like him didn't stop for people like her. They never had. But Kayla's body sagged in her arms. Margaret made a choice she couldn't undo. She stepped into the light, lifted her frozen hand, and knocked. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know what he believed. She only knew this was her last chance, and that whatever happened next would decide whether they survived the night. The man inside the car looked up slowly, startled, as if the sight before him didn't make sense at first. An elderly woman in a thin robe, snow clinging to her hair, a small child limp in her arms. For a moment nothing happened. The engine hummed. The windshield wipers kept moving, steady and indifferent, like time itself refusing to pause. Margaret felt that silence stretch, heavy and humiliating. She had lived long enough to recognize it. The moment when someone decided whether your suffering was worth their inconvenience. She knocked again, harder this time, her palms slapping the glass because her fingers could no longer curl into a fist. Her voice cracked as she begged, the words tumbling out through chattering teeth, through fear she could no longer hide. The window lowered just a fraction. Cold air rushed inside the car. The man's eyes flicked to Kayla, then back to Margaret's face. There was hesitation there, calculation, the kind that came from living in a world where stopping for the wrong person could cost you something. Margaret saw it clearly, and it hurt more than the cold. Then Kayla's head fell back. Her body went slack, her breathing shallow and uneven, her small chest barely rising. Margaret screamed. A raw sound ripped from deep inside her, louder than the wind, louder than her pride. She shook Kayla gently, desperately, whispering her name over and over as if saying it enough times might pull her back. That was when the car door flew open. Suddenly, everything moved fast. The man was there, hands steady, voice sharp with urgency. The warmth of the car hit Margaret like a shock as she climbed inside, clutching Kayla against her chest. The heater roared to life. The door slammed shut, sealing them away from the storm that had nearly swallowed them whole. As the car pulled away, tires sliding briefly on ice, Margaret looked down at her granddaughter's face, too pale now, too still. Fear flooded her in waves. She didn't know where they were going. She didn't know if it was already too late. All she knew was that she had trusted a stranger in a world that had shown her very little mercy. And whatever waited at the end of that road, help or heartbreak, it was coming fast. The car cut through the storm as if racing against time itself. Snow slammed into the windshield, the road nearly invisible, every turn a gamble. Inside the vehicle, the air was thick with heat and panic. Margaret held Kayla tightly, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken in years, feeling the child's fragile chest rise and fall, too fast, too shallow, as if each breath might be her last. Kayla's skin burned against Margaret's hands. Her eyes fluttered open once, unfocused, then rolled back again. That was when the fear turned absolute. Not the quiet fear of poverty or the familiar fear of being ignored, but the terrifying realization that the world might take the last thing she loved, and no one would be held accountable. The hospital lights finally appeared through the snow, harsh and blinding. The car skidded to a stop, doors flying open as cold air rushed in again. Everything blurred after that, voices shouting, footsteps pounding, strangers reaching for Kayla. Margaret tried to follow, tried to keep hold of her granddaughter, but her legs buckled beneath her. She was left standing there, empty-handed, watching Kayla disappear through swinging doors. Time stretched cruelly. Minutes felt like hours. Margaret sat alone under fluorescent lights, soaked, shaking, invisible once again. She had done everything she could, loved harder, fought longer, endured more than anyone should have to, and still it might not be enough. Around her, people passed without looking. Nurses moved quickly. Doors opened and closed. Life continued, indifferent to her terror. She wondered if this was how injustice truly worked, not with shouting or cruelty alone, but with silence, with systems that waited too long to care. Then footsteps approached. A doctor stopped in front of her, expression unreadable. Margaret couldn't breathe. She couldn't stand. She couldn't prepare herself for the words that were coming. In that moment, everything rested on a single sentence, one that would decide whether the night ended in survival or in irreversible loss. And before the doctor spoke, Margaret realized something chilling. No matter what happened next, nothing about this night would ever leave her unchanged. Kayla survived the night. The fever broke just in time, pulled back from the edge by medication, warmth, and a race against hours that almost ran out. Margaret sat beside her hospital bed as dawn crept in through narrow windows, watching her granddaughter breathe steadily again. Relief came in quiet waves, mixed with exhaustion so deep it felt heavier than grief. They had been spared, but only barely. Nothing about their lives returned to normal. The house they lost did not magically reappear. The fear did not fade with the storm. Margaret understood now how thin the line truly was between stability and disaster, especially for families already living at the margins. One illness, one missed payment, one system that looked away. That was all it took. What happened to Margaret and Kayla was not an accident. It was the result of a structure that punishes poverty, ignores the vulnerable, and too often treats certain lives as disposable. Racism does not always announce itself with shouting or violence. Sometimes it shows up as indifference, as predatory rules enforced only on those with no power, as a quiet acceptance that suffering is normal as long as it happens to the right people. But that night also revealed something else. That change often begins with a single choice, one person deciding not to look away, one moment of humanity cutting through a system built on neglect. It did not erase the injustice, but it interrupted it. Margaret never forgot the cold of that street or the fear of almost losing everything. And she never forgot how close the world came to letting it happen without consequence. This is not just her story. It is a mirror held up to all of us. How many more nights like this are unfolding right now, unseen? And when desperation knocks on the window, will we be the ones who look away or the ones who stop and help?